We started the recording, Helen.
Yes, we're recording now.
Okay, perfect. Is Mel there to kick off? Oh, Melanie's coming back in now.
Meeting. Rob, are you here? Would you like to say hello?
We're just waiting to admit Melanie, who's going to be kicking off. Are you here now, Mel?
I am here. Yes, I've just been asking.
Perfect.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I've just been asking if anyone could hear me and there was an echoing silence. But you can hear me now, can't you?
Yeah, we can. Yes, thank you.
Fab.
Yeah.
Right, let me start that again. Apologies to anyone who's heard me going, hello, is anyone there? And welcome everybody to today's UKOA meeting. I'm Mel Hingarani, a consultant from Moorfields. I'm the chair and I co-chair with Alison Beale that you've just heard speak. And this morning's meeting, I'm chairing together with Rob Cooper from the RNIB. Rob, do you want to quickly say hello? Can we make sure Rob's actually able to unmute himself as well, please?
I'm not sure he can hear us.
No. I hope he can. Because that's going to scupper our meeting, isn't it? We can't hear from...
I know.
All right. Well, let's press on for now and hope that we can get Rob on in a second. Can we have the next slide, please? It's the usual housekeeping rules, and obviously many of you will know that we were aiming to have today as a face-to-face meeting. We'd already had to move it once because of the train strike, and surprise, surprise, another train strike landed on the day. So we decided just to go ahead for the morning with the virtual meeting. We'll hope to have face-to-face later. So as we are virtual, just the usual house rules, please. So please stay on mute unless you are speaking. We have tried to feed in question and answer sessions after each presentation. So do raise your hands during the sessions and we'll come to you at the end of the session. And we ask you just to say who you are briefly when you're asking something. And also please do use the chat function. People are usually pretty lively on the chat function and we can have questions and comments coming throughout the presentation so we can then come to them at the end. And as usual, we'll be recording the webinar and we'll share this along with the slides on the UKOA website after the meeting, and we'll send all the members a link. Have the next slide, please. Okay, so you can see just about the agenda today. So we really decided to try and do something that's very patient focused today. One of the most important things about the UKOA is the partnership that we have, not just across all the different professionals and clinical and healthcare organisations, but also really strong partnerships with charities and with patients. So we really do try and be patient-centred, and we really wanted to concentrate on that aspect of our work this morning. And we have sort of a range of presentations all around that theme, and in particular there's a theme about how can we really embed better patient support throughout the whole eye care journey, which we can get into the details of later. Have the next slide, please. So we've arranged a schedule of meetings now as per members' requests to try and now sort of get all the dates of the meetings out in advance so you can get them all in the diary. And again, as per members' requests, there is a mixture of virtual, and most of the meetings are virtual, but we're trying to have 2 face-to-face meetings a year because people said these were very valuable. So because of the train strikes, we're now planning to have another face-to-face meeting on the 1st of June and really hoping to make this worthwhile and worth the effort of physically coming, and to also reinvigorate that networking in the UKOA that we all felt was very useful, and fingers crossed the trains will be all right that day. The themes of the next few meetings are based on the topics requested by members from previous surveys or from people getting in touch, but we'd really like from people to get in touch further about what other topics would you like us to have for themed meetings, or if you've done something, you know, whether it's something completed or something that's a bit of a challenge that you think might be interesting to members and you might like to share, then you can put in the chat box now, or please just email us. And if you're not quite sure how it fits, we're more than happy to have a chat. I think the other thing I just wanted to say was I've been chair of this from the beginning, and I really think I'm cutting down a bit on my work now, and I really think it's time for fresh blood. So I'll be looking to stop chairing in the latter part of this year, and we'll be looking to appoint another chair. We haven't completely decided with the board exactly how that application process is going to work, but there will be a paid session a week to do it. And I think if people are interested, or they know people who might be interested or suitable, please feel free to put them in touch informally, because I think the more we start thinking about that now, the more we're likely we are to be able to have someone, because it really does take an enthusiastic chair to keep this to keep the whole show on the road. The next slide, please. And so you can just see there some of the upcoming events. So we've got a really exciting one on paediatrics coming up in February, and then another really great one focused around nursing in April. You can see the other dates, and as the way we're just fleshing out the topics. So if people have great ideas, do feel free to suggest them. Otherwise, we'll do topics which we think will be of interest. The next slide, please. Yeah, the next slide.
Sorry, Mel, it's been really slow. I am clicking to the next slide. Bear with me
Yeah,
a
no
minute.
worries. The joy of Teams. Just while we're waiting, is Rob now there and able to actually talk to us? You come back to you and say hi, Rob. Well,
yeah, hi. Sorry about that. My daughter did say that the earphones were playing up, and I must have picked up the old pair that's broken. So I'm sat there. Yes, so I can hear now. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today on what hopefully is going to be a great session. Well, a few good sessions all around patient support and some of the initiatives that are taking place. So welcome everybody.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. And then with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lance and Lisa, and it's really real delight to have you here talking about people with learning disabilities. So over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you so much for the invitation and this opportunity to talk about the eye care journey for people with a learning disability. I'm Lisa, I'm an optometrist. I've been at Seeability for nearly a decade now. I've got a background, I'm an optometrist of working in hospital and community opticians. And I'm with my colleague Lance. Hi Lance, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, my name is Lance Campbell. I'm a London eye care champion for Seeability.
And it's interesting you talk about the eye care journey. Lance, do you want to just mention your eye care journey when you, as a person with lived experience?
So yeah, before I joined Seeability, I never had an eye test. It wasn't something that my family and I got round to doing, and I didn't realize how important it was until I joined Seeability. And I learned how important that having an eye test is, especially for people with learning disabilities and autism. So I went for my first eye test in Specsavers, and once I mentioned to the opticians that I never had an eye test, they gave me an appointment straight away, so I didn't know what to expect. And they ran through some of the tests with me. Some of them was a bit surprising for me, but I managed to get through them. And my eyes were like a small prescription, but nothing too serious. So now I just go for an eye test once every 2 years.
Brilliant, thank you. So can we have the next slide? So yeah, Lance, despite being in a group that, as we'll talk about, is 10 times more likely to have an eye problem, it's actually the #1 comorbidity of learning disability is sight loss. And yet Lance is kind of living proof that that message isn't always getting out there. So just to tell you a little bit about Seeability, I'm going to hand back over to Lance.
So Seeability is a charity, and it has been for over 220 years, supporting nearly 250 people with learning disabilities and autism and sight loss across Southern England as a registered social care provider. We also run fundraised projects and programs to help address the inequalities and exclusions that many people with disabilities experience. This includes our public health eye care program with eye care champions, reaching out to peer-to-peer to the 1.5 million people with learning disabilities to look after their eyesight. My role as an eye care champion is to go across to people to different health groups or self-advocacy groups at university and try and promote eye care for people with learning disabilities and autism, because like Lisa said, the message is not always getting out there, and it's very important, especially now with the inequalities that are still happening.
Thank you, Lance. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it's the #1 comorbidity of learning disabilities, sight loss, and the evidence shows that a person with a learning disability is 10 times more likely to have a sight problem. For children, that goes up to 28 times. And our work and the work of others in special schools, where we tested nearly 1,000 children, we evidenced that the need for glasses is often very high, up to 40% in children and over 60% in adults, and often to high prescriptions. Obviously, prematurity is associated with high refractive error. And then we've also got a significant incidence of non-correctable sight loss, with probably 30 to 40% of the special school population having some kind of CVI, cerebral visual impairment. And yet, shockingly, when we did our work, we were discovering that less than 1 in 10 had ever had a sight test, and 4 in 10 of the children with an average age of 11 had absolutely no history of any eye care at all. So clearly, like Lance, people are missing out. Next slide, please.
Sorry, it's going a bit slow again.
Bear
with me.
So yeah, so we have these two. We talk a lot about the eye care journey, as you did. Lance is going to tell you a little bit about a young man, Nathaniel, who we met a few years ago in his special school.
So when we first met Nathaniel at his school, Nathaniel's age 14, and he had challenging behavior in his class. He was diagnosed with autism, and he is profoundly deaf, and was described then by mum as having no useful means of communication. And we found Nathaniel needed a -18D prescription, because it was just there was just no way he could really communicate that he was having problems with his eyes, so no one really knew about his condition. Once we gave Nathaniel glasses and kept going for regular checks on his eyes and glasses, we explained what Nathaniel could see with and without his glasses to his mum and his teachers. He is now at a special school and has learned BSL. His challenging behavior was down to his poor vision, and no one knew it until he went for his eye test.
Yeah, so it's a really good example of diagnostic overshadowing. A lot of the signs of his severe myopia were put down to Nathaniel's autism, and actually he can now do a pretty standard sight test. At this point, we had to go into the classroom and do lots of desensitization, and it was by retinoscopy. But now he can sign the bottom line on it. He's got 0.0 vision, and he can sign the bottom line of a letter chart. So his path would have gone very different if he hadn't had his eyes tested. And of course, it's shocking that that wasn't picked up earlier. So that's the sort of story that we're finding in school. And in the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about some other examples of people with learning disabilities where they've had diagnostic overshadowing and bad experiences. So I can do it without the slides, so don't panic. But we have an example of a young lady who was non-verbal in adulthood, was rubbing her eyes a lot, going to her GP, and being diagnosed various anti-inflammatories, antihistamines. This is Sally in the top photo, and Sally she was obviously in pain, and her pressures when she actually finally got to a sight test were through the roof. And at that point she'd lost most of her sight. And it was really because she was rubbing her eyes, no one understood she was, in pain, and that her pressure, and she just wasn't getting routine eye care. And her mum's been an amazing advocate for getting community eye tests better and trying to get pathways in place so that people can be seen in the community. Another example is a lady who has recently came to see one of Seeability supported living services, who at the age of 44 went into, she has Down syndrome, she went into a dementia care home because her behaviours had changed. She became very withdrawn and confused. Cataracts were completely missed. When she had access cataract surgery, a lot of that was reversed and the dementia diagnosis was actually rescinded. So again, her life very different, and that diagnostic overshadowing the real danger that it was assumed that she was having cognitive decline when actually it was visual decline. So I hope those stories give you some example of why we feel there's still issues in the system there, and that people's journeys with people with learning disabilities aren't always great. So if we can have the next slide. So Lance, do you want to talk about the things that Seeability are doing to try and make those changes?
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to interrupt you a minute, saying that, Helen, I don't know if you want to try sending the copy of the slides to Alison and I, and we could try sharing and just see if we get any better luck.
I will do.
All right, thanks. Sorry, could you carry on? Sorry about that.
No, thanks, Mel. Lance.
So some of the things we are doing is producing the only national easy read resources on eye care, from sight tests through to different eye conditions, and using eye drops. Hold a database of opticians, optometrists who want to publicize. They can support people with learning disabilities and autism. We offer support and advice on either phone or email. Train eye care and learning disability professionals by doing presentations and giving sessions about eye care. Influence commissioning of eye care adjusted eye tests. Support people with learning disabilities and their supporters to be more eye care aware. We do that by doing the presentations or or even informal sessions.
And so one of the things we're doing as part of that big, as I said, we were funded by DHSC to do this big study of nearly 1,000 children that we published. And we used that along with a framework paper, which was a model of eye care, to go to NHS England and say special school students are missing out. And in response to that, NHS England developed the Special Schools Eye Care Service. They set up a working group, and this model of eye care was rolled out from April 21. And we're one of about 60 providers now providing this in London, the North East and the North West. Currently, the rollout's been paused for an evaluation, but we're still really, lobbying hard to kind of ensure that we've got primary eye care being devolved down to ICS level. So we really want to see that being mandated at ICS level in every area. The NHS model is, as I say, it's been co-produced with with the Royal College of Ophthalmologists, with BIOS, with the College of Optometrists, with ABDO. Basically, this model is all about going to the children in their comfortable place and providing the eye care there. It's an opt-out model, and critically, it provides glasses as well. So if a child needs glasses, as 40% of them do, there's a dispensing optician is key to the team, and that dispensing optician provides the children with 2 pairs of glasses because they're all deemed to be vulnerable because of being in a special school. So we don't have to go through this complicated claims process to get a spare. And unlike where I've worked in a hospital, when you'd issue a voucher and then they had to navigate the high street to try and get that made up into a well-fitting pair of glasses, the children get the glasses in school. They're supported to wear them in school. We give a written report to the teaching staff as well as the parents, so everyone understands what the children's visual abilities are. There's been some more great work done by Catherine Saunders and her team in Northern Ireland she's published evidence that sounds quite obvious, but understanding what the children can see improves their educational and behavioural attainment. But that we were asked for that evidence of outcomes, so that the team there delivered that, and that's strong evidence. The data coming out of the school service so far is really paralleling the work that Seeability did earlier, and also the work that's been done in Northern Ireland and in Wales and in Bradford by Rachel Pilling and her team. They're all published too, which shows that, again, this really high incidence of unmet need, and critically as well, we're getting children are being referred out of hospital for their routine care and for ongoing refractive and visual assessment care. So referrals into hospital are actually very low, about 2.6%, and we're getting referrals out because children, when they're sent into the community, are often bouncing back in again. So it really meets the agenda of releasing the pressure on secondary ophthalmology clinics. So this slide just really, I've discovered I can navigate myself as well. So there's actually something at the bottom to do that. So that's good. Sorry, I didn't realise that at the beginning.
I've now got the slides, so I'm just wondering, Helen, do you want to try unsharing, and I will try sharing and see if I have any better luck.
Thank you. So this slide here is just really to show you why we think the special school service is so great, why it works so well. As I said, the dispensing is really, really key. It's about meeting the children in their own setting. It's about the model that's been commissioned is all about having the same clinicians going. So it's named clinicians in a school. What we were concerned about is if it became like domiciliary optical services, where unfortunately often they descend on different care homes and things just once, and then they're being different organisations are offering services which means the children don't get to know the clinicians. So we work, going back to Nathaniel, for example, he was very challenging, and there's lots of students like that. And it was a case of sticking my head around the door every week when I was in his school. We're there most weeks in a school with 100 children. That's a clinic roughly once a week. And it just means that we can get to know the students. We can do social stories and desensitisation with the class, with the support of the class. If a child's having a bad day, it doesn't matter. We can swap things out, so there's no issues with not being brought or DNAs. So we always have a full clinic. Less time out for families. These families have got so many appointments to get to, and if you've got an orthoptic, a refraction and an ophthalmology clinic, and then you've got to come back for drops, etc., it can be a real challenge when you're also going to the wheelchair clinic and the dysphasia clinic and the epilepsy clinic, so it really means they're not missing out. So we did a parent survey last year, and it was 95% absolutely choose this model over other options. And yeah, the children get that glasses support in school as well, which is critical. Something I've experienced in the past is professional colleagues saying, oh, well, children with learning disabilities, they never get on with their glasses, which I don't like to hear, but it happens. And, that's because they do. It's a massive sensory change. They're often getting given big prescriptions late in their development. So it's going to take a lot to get used to. So, yeah, next slide, please. So we really want to see this, the NHS service being set up in every ICS region. And Lance, do you want to talk about the easy eye care pathway as well?
NHS Special Schools Eye Care Service across England, and then the Easy Eye Care Lock-Through pathway is in every ICS. So adults with learning disabilities and children not in special schools have a local service that is geared up to see people with more severe learning disabilities having eye tests. So we're trying to get that more across London, especially for people with learning disabilities and autism.
Yeah, so you work specifically in London, don't you, trying to talk to ICSs? Basically, if you may be aware of the minor eye conditions, the community urgent eye care services. LOCSU's an organisation that commissions services outside of the general ophthalmic service direct with ICSs for local optical practices. We work with them in COVID to develop a pathway for people with learning disabilities. So they just get paid an additional fee. So people don't, what we find is a lot of people with learning disabilities, adults, either aren't getting care or they're getting routine refractive care and monitoring of pressures, etc., in hospital because the GOS isn't fit for purpose for them. So this is just an additional pathway to allow them to access a fit for purpose, fully reasonably adjusted test in the community. So I hope that's interesting. If you do have any questions, and I think we've just about come in time. But yeah, do look up more about our work, and thank you so much again, Mel, and everybody for this opportunity. Very grateful.
Thank you ever so much. That was really, really interesting. And it's, as you say, it's and I think you both, you and Lance, you've made a really really good, compelling case, particularly, you know, about why this is so important and how people can't advocate for themselves. And I think, you know, people make assumptions, don't they, about people with learning disabilities. Oh, that's just the way they are, or you know, they can't engage with these things. And you know, that particular case he shared about the young fellow with the high myopia is you know, it's amazing. It's very heartwarming, but it makes you worried about all the other people who are not getting that. I'll kick off the questions if I may, and then obviously people do raise their hands. I'd be interested to hear from people in the audience about what they do currently. Do they have anything like this locally? If not, are they, you know, what they're doing? Because I know that in many places I've worked with, I'm a paediatric ophthalmologist, you know, people have to, if they get any care, they have to come into hospital, and then everyone just sort of tends to put, even the adults with learning disabilities tend to go in the paediatric clinic because, you know, we perhaps got slightly more of the you know, the skills, but it's not ideal. So what Lisa, what do you think are the big barriers to spreading out the non-special, you know, the LOXU pathway?
It's just primarily, I think there's been a sea change, and now we're getting the hospital services really behind this as well. So one of the things we've found is really effective is talking to people like yourselves and getting ophthalmologists to come and say, we're seeing adults with learning disabilities in a paediatric clinic. They should be seen in the community. So we've had in London, as Lance said, ophthalmologists from Guy's and St Thomas's and some from your Croydon, Moorfields at Croydon, coming to meetings with commissioners to explain that situation and getting it commissioned. We've then got the job. We need people like Lance to then go out to peers and get people to come into these pathways once we've got them established. So I think we've also, you know, the commissioners in ICSs have got all of these other pathways that they're, you know, and we're just one very small ophthalmology pathway. So it's hopefully it's a little bit more promising now. It's ICS level rather than when we were trying to do that with CCG commissioners. But it's still a challenge because it is always going to be a relatively low volume pathway. But I think having that support from secondary care on working groups trying to get these pathways set up. So we've got a pathway across the northwest of England. We're very close to one in southeast London. And if you want us to support you in your region in trying to make contact with the ICS, trying to get something like this established, so that, and if you can prove numbers that you'd be able to discharge out into it, for example, you know, that's all really helpful. But do get in touch with us at Seeability and we'd love to support.
Do you have anything? I know that I've sort of seen things in the past from LOXU where they've had, so they did this for the Qs, the COVID urgent eye care, where they, you know, shared maps, which we put on the NHS England website, just to show what the coverage was. I don't know if there's any sort of data, particularly visual data like that we might be able to help share, because I think that's, and I know that, you know, Bath have done similar things around the sort of, I know it's not for learning disability, but just around the school screening, just to show in a real visual way, look at where this is and look at, you know, these people are doing it and you're not. So I don't know if there's anything like that. It's certainly something we could put on both, I think, the iCare Hub and the UKOA website if they exist. Yeah,
there's LOXU should be producing that. Yeah, it should be out there. It might even be out there as we speak. So I will get that forwarded to you guys, and then we can see how it can be shared. Like I said, at the moment, it's already commissioned across the northwest and southeast London, very close to being so. But that's a really good idea, Mel, to get that map shared more, because there's maps about glaucoma repeat measures, Qs. So we need to, we're just always saying this needs to be one of those pathways that you know about and that you know that then you can support the commissioning of in your area, because it's a newer and it's a smaller volume one, but and it's different. I
mean, the other thing we're sort of thinking about is revamping the UKOA website, and I could really see something where we could have a page on this if you maybe want to do that and think about content. We could put the map on and maybe sort of resources to help people to make the case locally. And you know, where we've in the past done sort of case studies about people who've done this successfully. So where you say you have the Northwest one, that might make a really good case study. And also thinking about people in the UKOA always love a practical resource. If you have any example business case documents, and we could anonymize them, if necessary. But I think that can be really, really sort of helpful, so people don't have to, they can build on the success and they don't have to develop it all from scratch, although obviously people have got to populate these things with their own data and requirements. So maybe just a few things to think about there.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'd love to do that, so we'll liaise about how we can get those things live. Fantastic, thank you.
Sounds fab. And I don't know, Rob, I don't know whether or not you've got any sort of, given your the co-chair, just as you wanted to make any sort of comments from your side.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I remember early in my career, I worked for a learning disability charity, and I took a team of athletes to the the National Games up in Scotland. And part of that program was to go into kind of like a health village to get not just their eyes looked at, but their teeth looked at, their feet looked at. And it was just surprising how many of those individuals came out the other end with glasses, or, had treatments on the feet, had been, given letters that they need to go to the local dentistry and things like that. So is there something, you talk about volume and the numbers being quite low, has there been any work to kind of team up with other specialities like dentistry to try and do a bit of a one-stop shop where you get people together? Because I'm just thinking, I was also a carer for a young autistic man, and I used to have to help his parents and take him to appointments, and it was an absolute nightmare, I'll be honest, just because of the fear of going into that kind of environment. So again, is there ways that are being looked at different kind of environments to try and or kind of like safe spaces for people to go that's not necessarily the same kind of medical kind of environment? Because I know that certainly from my experience with Stephen was really hard.
I think that's, Rob, you've just explained why the special schools model works so brilliantly for the kids, because that's what so many parents tell us, that they, the trauma of the hospital car park, that they can't go in. So that's the ones you have, and that's why people give up, and that's why a lot of adults give up too. But I think a question about, whether community going to an optical practice, again, it's still going to, I think there's questions around, better domiciliary perhaps, but the long-term plan has got a commitment for dentistry, audiology and eye care for people with learning disabilities, and for those services in special schools specifically. So I think those other areas definitely completely agree what you're saying, and it's what we hear a lot from families, that if you can have one-stop shops, and that's what we often use, actually, that phrase that you said about the eye care, it is a one-stop eye care shop, the special school service, so they haven't got to go to lots of different clinics and then the opticians afterwards.
I'm gonna be really annoying now to Judith, because actually Alison's reminding me that we have another presenter in this session. So I'll come back to you, Judith, hopefully in a minute. But I'm just going to reshare the slides and then just continue with Retina UK, just to talk about their work. Let me see if we can. So welcome to Paula, and many thanks for coming. Let me just whip through these. Right, there we go.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to join you this morning. I am very conscious of time. I think this session is due to end in a few moments.
Sorry, that's my fault.
I'll whiz through as quickly as I can. So yes, I'm Paula. I'm Deputy Chief Executive at Retina UK, and I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about who we are, the work of the charity, how we determine our priorities in the organisation, and then to give you a very brief overview of our services. Next slide, please. So Retina UK is the only UK charity that is dedicated solely to supporting people with inherited sight loss conditions, so progressive sight loss. There are two main strands to our work. The first is that we stimulate for medical research, as we search for causes and treatments. And the second is the provision of day-to-day information and support for all those affected by inherited sight loss. We are growing our activity around campaigning and influencing, also acknowledging this is a really important area for us. Next slide, please. So as far as how we do this is concerned, just to stress, we're here for everyone with an interest in inherited sight loss, including professionals who support those living with these conditions and their families. We offer practical support, emotional support, and a really important part of our activity is to facilitate connections. And that might be peer-to-peer support for those living with inherited sight loss, or by example, connecting our community to those involved in research activity. All of our information support services are free to access, and they can be accessed at any point on someone's journey, accepting, of course, that a progressive sight loss condition is not linear, and someone can experience a point of impact that might mean they then require support at any point. Next slide, please. We work in partnership, and we simply couldn't do what we do if we didn't work with many others. Most importantly, our community, but also professionals working in health, social care and education, other sight loss charities, primarily through the VI Charity Sector Partnership, industry. We're often involved in finding people to get involved in focus groups, and decision makers such as regulatory bodies as we start to see potential treatments coming through to market. Next slide, please. We have an incredible team of volunteers, a few of whom are pictured here. We have around 75 active volunteers at the moment, and they deliver many of our services. And I mean, I can't overemphasize the importance of people speaking to somebody who genuinely knows what it's like to live with this condition or to support somebody with a condition. All of our volunteers live with an inherited sight loss condition. Next slide, please. So we genuinely put our community at the heart of everything we do. We listen to them to inform and help us prioritise our activity. As I've said, we work in collaboration with others as we're striving to develop the momentum that's required to get some treatments through. Ultimately, what we're hoping for is treatments for all those who live with inherited sight loss conditions. Next slide, please. There are two key ways that we do this. The first is through our lived experience panel. So we've currently got about 450 of our community who have signed up to say that they're really keen to get involved in studies. This could be working alongside researchers. It could be speaking on behalf of the community. It might be that they're getting involved in our activity and doing accessibility testing, for example, for our website and other projects. And this just gives a huge sense of empowerment, positivity and hope to those who might otherwise be struggling to see where the future is. Next slide, please. But a critical piece of work for us we introduced in 2019, and this is Retina UK's Sight Loss Survey. It's a 3-year tracking survey. The first time we did it, we received around 1,000 responses. This had dropped to about 673 last year, but still a good number from our community. We're in touch with about just under 8,000 people affected by inherited sight loss. And we use the information that they've given us to really determine the priorities and the projects that we run. Next slide, please. I just wanted to touch briefly on what we learned around experience at point of diagnosis. I appreciate this is a very complicated and busy slide, but hopefully when the slides are shared, you'll have time to digest it. But what it does tell us is that people's experiences around point of diagnosis, when we asked them, had improved over the last 20 years. So those diagnosed 20 years ago had a worse experience, if you like, than those diagnosed more recently. Although sadly, what we did see is a significant deterioration in that diagnosis experience in the last year. We do believe that's almost certainly linked to the pandemic, but just something that we are very mindful of. Next slide, please. Sadly, what we did discover is only 1 in 3 people had heard about Retina UK from a healthcare professional. We're really keen to increase this because we know we can make a difference for people. But at the moment, we're relying on many people finding us on Dr. Google on an internet search. Goodness knows what else they might be finding. And of course, that means there's a lack of awareness of our work, and we can't enable people to use the information we can provide to make informed choices. Next slide, please. So as far as the difference that we make is concerned, 83% of respondents rated our information and support services as excellent or good. Next slide, please. And we were able to gain some really detailed information about better outcomes we were able to achieve for people. So this slide explains how 52% of people who have not engaged with us told us that they'd experienced loneliness, compared to 31% who had. 49% sadly had experienced isolation, compared with 36% of those who have engaged with us, and 47% have not engaged and experienced depression, compared with 37% who had. Next slide, please. There's a nice quote here from somebody who talks about the fact they'd reached out to us several times and always been moved by the compassion and understanding of our organisation towards the visually impaired community. And as a relatively small organisation, we're often told by people that they genuinely feel that they know us and they are part of the community and almost the family that we are able to create. We know them, they know us. Next slide, please. And then the importance of research for our community was demonstrated by the fact that 70% of people are relying on Retina UK for information around current research activity, not only by that funded by Retina UK, but other activity that's happening. That was compared to just 27% who are learning that information from an ophthalmologist, albeit it may well be that some people have chosen no longer to engage with their ophthalmologist because many people told us that was a really negative experience for them because they were usually told that their sight had deteriorated, there was nothing specific that could be done for them, which is an area of concern in itself. So as far as the actual services we deliver are concerned, I'll just very quickly whiz through those. Next slide, please. We have a helpline that's available to anybody with an interest, professionals, family members and those living with inherited sight loss. The number is there and the email address. Next slide, please. And there's a quote here from somebody who just talked about the fact that they received a detailed and empathetic email in response to their inquiry. The instances of actually gaining help and support and receiving empathy are very few and far between. Next slide, please. For those who require support over a longer period of time, it might be somebody who's experienced some isolation. We can offer regular contact from a volunteer, and that's for as long as it's wanted. We do match people where we can, so quite often we match parents who just want to talk about their feelings and seek practical support for a child. We can hook parents up with each other, and they may have a weekly or even a quarterly conversation just to check in with each other. That really is just a time to talk. And then next slide, please. Our local peer support groups. This is a really growing area for us because our community told us that they wanted more contact in their local areas. So these are informal meetings, many of them now in person, some have remained online. We're going to grow another 12 groups next year, so we'll be approaching the 30 mark. And this just gives people the opportunity to talk to others who genuinely know what they're going through and create that sense of belonging. Again, these are all volunteer-led resources. Next slide, please. There's a nice quote here from somebody who talks about the warmth and energy and just feeling part of something, a huge sense of solidarity and shared vision and purpose. Next slide, please. So we hold webinars and we've got a website, lots of information shared there. We've got a new website actually that we're launching in the spring. Next slide, please. We've got webinars and podcasts. So we really are producing information in various formats. Obviously, all of this is available after the event. They're recorded so people can dip into this information as and when it suits them, and most importantly in a format that works for them. Next slide, please. So again, we get excellent feedback from webinars. In particular, they're a growing area for us. We do one of these every month. We've had from research, technology, sport, condition specific sessions, and we usually get around 50 people on our webinars, and that practical advice is really appreciated. Next slide, please. So we hold a variety of information support events through the year. This year, our professionals conference, which I would encourage you to attend if you're able to, will be held on the 23rd of June, and our annual conference on the 24th of June. These will be hybrid events. The face-to-face element will be held in London. Again, these events are recorded. And then next slide, please. I just want to touch very briefly on a couple of key resources. Sorry, I am very conscious of time, so I appreciate I'm whizzing through. Am I okay to finish?
You're absolutely fine. Don't worry, we've built flexibility into the programme, so just take your time.
Thank you very much. So Unlock Genetics, we created Unlock Genetics, a new resource, because our 2019 survey, a massive 43% of us told us, people told us that they were not aware of genetic testing, or this hadn't been offered to them, which was a real challenge for us because genetic testing is so important for our community. Now, it may be some of these people had been diagnosed some time ago when genetic testing wasn't available, but it wasn't simply the case. We'd also got people that had been diagnosed within the last couple of years and hadn't been offered the opportunity for genetic testing and counselling. So we created a resource called Unlock Genetics. We liaised and collaborated with a number of experts to create this resource. It's been really well received and it's been really well used, and basically it just presents information on genetic counselling, testing, inheritance patterns, etc. Accessible to a lay audience. It also tells them about where the clinics are based that they might be able to access for testing, and really opens this conversation, including video and audio content as well, along with some lived experiences of people who have had genetic testing and counselling. Next slide, please. And there's just a quote there from somebody who says they were very impressed by the clarity and comprehensiveness of the website's content, as well as the ease in which they could find the information and move around sections. So please do signpost to Unlock Genetics if you feel that would be a useful resource for the people you're supporting. Next slide, please. And then I touched earlier a little bit about the emotional impacts and the psychological impacts of inherited sight loss. And we were really dismayed, albeit probably not surprised, when we learned that 92% of our community told us that they'd experienced negative emotional or psychological impacts. And we really feel there's a lot of discussion, I'm pleased to say, around this now, but actually there still wasn't accessible practical support for people. So what we set out to do at Retina UK was to create a resource that enabled us to have that conversation with people, to normalise the conversation, to help people to accept that, you know, emotional impacts and the practical impacts need to be considered side by side. It shouldn't just be the practical side of things. In fact, the emotional impacts can be more damaging for people on a day-to-day basis. So we created Discover Wellbeing. It's an online course. There is a course aimed at those supporting people with inherited sight loss, and courses aimed at those who are living with the condition. It's free to access. They work through a number of modules, audio and video. And we give people the opportunity to have the support of a trained wellbeing volunteer. And what that means is they'll have a regular check-in with somebody who can just ask how they're getting on. They're not a counsellor. It's somebody who's simply trained to help them through the course, to talk about how they're getting on with some of the modules and whether they've been able to use those practical tools that they're learning in their day-to-day life. And just to finish, I thought this was quite a nice quote from somebody who had accessed the Discover Wellbeing resource. And this lady said to us, armed with this new knowledge that there are people like the volunteer support at Retina UK, I no longer want to retreat. I want to advance. I want to move forward and move on. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm happy to answer any questions or follow up after the meeting. And if anybody would like to see a copy of our sight loss surveys, I'd be very happy to share those. Or if you'd like leaflets for clinics or cards, then do let me know. We can get those sent out to you. But please do refer to us. You can trust us. You know, we can work in collaboration, genuinely make a difference for those living with inherited sight loss. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. And I think we've got time for a couple of quick comments. I think that, you know, this is difficult, I think, area because there are lots of people being seen. You know, if people get seen in the kind of big genetics clinics, they tend to have a big team and they tend to be a bit better, although I know that that is not always the case, even in Morphers. But a lot of people with genetic conditions are being seen in paediatric eye clinics, in general clinics, and they're seeing people who are not terribly comfortable. They certainly don't know much about the research and they don't quite know what to do. And it's, I think, a bit depressing on both sides because, as you say, it's progressive. For 99.9% of people, there's a feeling of, well, there's nothing we can do, so just, you know, get out of my clinic and stop bugging me. And it's a real negativity. So I think it's a particularly vulnerable set of patients. And I think my understanding is true is Declan probably know, he's here talking about CVIs. Isn't inherited retinal dystrophy either the top or one of the top causes of registration for visual impairment in the working age group? So this is like a significant, there's not, you know, I think it's seen, and I think Retina UK has probably been suffered from being seen as something really niche. It's not like glaucoma. Oh, it's tiny, but in fact, it's not tiny, is it?
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think these are people who just want to get on and live their lives and get on with their careers and, you know, look after their families. And there is so much that can be done, but we need to be able to have those conversations with people, accepting that in clinic there's just not the time. And absolutely right, as far as genetics is concerned, it's a massive postcode lottery as to where you're seen, whether or not you get, you know, any kind of conversation relating to genetic counselling testing.
Declan, I think you're unmuting. You can tell us, can't you, probably off the top of your head, the CVI rate for
There it
Yes,
is.
there you go. Brilliant.
And it's in colour for those of you who have got cones. This is hereditary eye disease, which is in red, and you'll see that it's below, but not substantially below glaucoma, and diabetes is less than inherited eye disease now, which reflects the treatment effects over the years. Inherited eye disease is the commonest cause of visual impairment in the working population age, which is this slide is the overall slide, but in the population between about up to 65, inherited eye disease is the commonest cause of registered visual impairment, and has been since about 2014. It's been a very obvious shift. So that I think demonstrates that more. Bear in mind, there's more registration and more recognition of inherited eye disease now than there was in the past. A lot of what was called macular degeneration was almost certainly manifestations of hereditary eye disease, which were not really recognised, and that is still the case.
Thanks, Declan. So as you mind and sharing. So I think this is something that Alison sort of reminded me to perhaps sort of mention to you, and perhaps we could pick this up outside the meeting. Both, several of the big charities are formal stakeholder members of UKOA and Seeability and Retina UK and not. So maybe we should have a sort of chat outside of the meeting about whether that's something you'd like to consider. And I do think I'd be quite interested in returning to in a future UKOA meeting to the whole inherited eye disease and links with Retina UK and other charities, just to see if perhaps we can do a little bit more about raising awareness. And I think the professionals would really welcome resources to help them help these patients more, and perhaps it's the sort of thing that the UKOA can facilitate quite nicely. So perhaps Paula and also Lisa will pick up with you after the meeting, just to see if we can build on these talks. But thank you both very much. And now I'm going to get slapped on the wrist big time for losing all this slide. Totally my fault. So I'm going to hand over to Rob now to take the next session. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks,
do you want me
Mel.
to pop the slides up?
Yeah, you can do it. And just on that one, it's all linked as well. I think it was interesting to see what Paula said about, the experience at the point of diagnosis. And I think at RNIB, when I first came to RNIB, we talked about this concept of no diagnosis without support. And Paula, you mentioned, is it time? Because of how people's experiences a few years ago compared to now. Is it a time thing? Is it a training thing around that diagnosis and getting the right information and support? So I think I'd welcome some kind of discussion and conversation around that at some point. But moving on, what I want to do today is, in this short slot, is just to give you an update. I mentioned it at a previous meeting with David about some work that we've been looking at around the eye care support pathway. So one of the strategic priorities for RNIB was to look at innovating an eye care support pathway, recognising that there's all this support available to patients across the various clinical journeys, but how do we ensure that patients get that support across those various journeys? So I want to just touch on some of the work that we've been doing. This has very much been a bit of a discovery phase to see if this is possible, see if we can embed patient support across the various pathways. So I just want to update you on that. So next slide, please. Okay, so what we started to do, and this was a piece of work that kind of, when I was supporting Mel and the team within the eye care transformation piece, we started to look at all the clinical pathways, and there'd been a review of those, and very much having conversations with the team about, how do we embed support at every stage of those pathways. So one of the things that we started to do was to do a bit of insight mapping. What do we know around the support that's available to people, and how do we try and get that support to people? So we started to look at creating a generic end-to-end pathway. Obviously, we've got all those clinical pathways, but what does the generic end-to-end pathway look like from a patient perspective? What happens at every stage? We undertook some a literature review. We looked at some primary data, and we started to try and understand some of the key pain points across that end-to-end pathway. And I think that, Paul has touched on some around that whole experience around diagnosis, but then what other pain points are there across the pathway? And I know Declan's going to talk about some of the challenges that we've had around CVI and some of the areas that we're looking there as well. So what did we find out? We started to find out that its support is fragmented, a bit disjointed, and it was reliant on individuals. It was reliant on people working in the various pathways, clinicians, actually mentioning about the support that was available to a patients, whether that be Retina UK, Glaucoma UK, Macular Society, RNIB, etc. And really the connections weren't really inheritant of the system, and so that was flagged. And then we also, patients didn't know really that there was a pathway and that they were on pathways. So what we want to try and look at is, what do we need? So we wanted to look at mapping that out and really understanding some of the key trigger points across those steps and stages. Next slide, please. So we mapped all that out. We kind of started to have a bit of an understanding of what we thought the pain points were across the stages, and we needed to kind of like validate that. So what we decided to do was to bring a load of people from across the UK to London. I think it was in November time now, to really kind of start to look at validating that end-to-end pathway and explore each stage of the pathway, right from first presentation within an optician, right through to rehabilitation and accessing of third sector support, and really start to understand what those pain points were, what those experiences were. So we put on a number of workshops. We went out with the support of the third sector partners. I think we consulted with about 400 plus patients in the end to ask them about their experiences across the pathways, really to try and get that deep dive understanding of some of the challenges that people faced. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a bit of a snapshot. So it's a bit of a schematic that just maps out what happens at that initial appointment in terms of the kind of journey a typical patient would go on. And we did that for the end-to-end pathway. So if for those who've been fortunate enough to see the raw data, we've basically got a massive diagram that has broken it down into each stage. And this is just a snapshot of what happens at having my initial appointment and touching on some of the wait time. But that hopefully gives you a flavour of what the raw output is. So next slide, please. Then we started to explore so we've got the kind of generic pathway, we've mapped it. What do the patient or the team that we work with, talked about citizens, what did they need to understand, or what were their requirements? So we looked at the journey. So what is that journey that people go on, and what did they need to understand about that journey that they were undertaking? Who will they be seeing? What are the kind of expectations? What's the onward process? Then we started to look at specifics around understanding my eye condition. What did I need to understand around my eye condition or suspected diagnosis? And then we also wanted to understand about what is the support available, not just from the clinical side of things, but also the non-clinical, so emotional, practical support that people needed to understand at every stage. Next slide, please. And this just gives you an example of what it looks like. So we've got the raw diagram, we've got the kind of the journey across the top, and then we've got these kind of free swim lanes that sit underneath every stage of the kind of generic pathway. So we've got to understand the journey, my eye condition, and getting some support. So again, it's really hard to kind of digest because it's so big and so vast. And I think Cal Freeman said it's the most in-depth kind of review that's been undertaken across this kind of pathway in terms of understanding the needs of patients. So next slide, please. So here's an example of some of the feedback and some of the things that we've kind of been working with our insights team around each stage of the journey. So having my initial appointment. So what did a patient need to understand? I understand the pathway. I know where to go for information, advice about the different eye conditions. So that
at that initial appointment, they get access to information and support, and it's not a Google search. It's not somebody leaving an optician and Googling what that potential diagnosis could be. Actually, they have clear understanding of the pathway, the journey, what's happening. And then some of the key indicators that we've been exploring is understanding the clinical process. So what is that clinical journey that I may be going on? Increased access to information, advice, and then increased confidence to ask questions when interacting with clinicians. So we know that a lot of people are waiting before they can get that secondary care appointment. So use that time wisely. Use that time to be able to understand what's happening, understand the journey that they may be going on, what appointments they have, and then have the confidence to ask the questions. Next slide, please. And then this is an example at stage 4, which is support after my diagnosis. So we've got a statement: I can manage my sight condition, its treatment and care. And then indicators would be to increase ability to manage sight condition, its treatment and care, increased understanding of eye care support pathway and how it can help, increased access to practical and emotional support. And it was interesting that people very much talked about getting early mental health and wellbeing support as early as possible on their journey. Increased ability to be mobile, but increased ability to live confidently and safely, independently in their community, and overall increased health and well-being. Next slide, please. Then we've been linking in with the team at NHSE and started to think about, well, you know, if we create a kind of eye care support pathway, yes, we've got all the things that we'd like a patient to experience, but what are some of the clinical improvements that this could lead to? So we've started to explore this around improve adherence to treatment, support self-care and self-management, PIFU related activities, earlier access to support, hopefully reduce it, give more time in appointments, etc. Reduction in DNA, so people have a clear understanding of what appointments they're attending, why they're attending it, and when. So hopefully that will reduce any DNAs. Improve general well-being of our population, and also just general improved eye health literacy of our community. Next slide, please. This is so what we've been doing with the raw output, we've been kind of sharing it with key people, and these are kind of some of the feedback that we've got and support so far. So I'm not going to read all those through, but you know, we are engaging with some of the key bodies to just really get an understanding of, you know, is this something that we've got backing and support for? Because it is very much a discovery phase, and we want to now look at taking it to the next step. So next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, where we're at, we're about to finish the kind of review of the raw output, so the raw diagram with the swim lanes, and I'm actually meeting with the company, the consultancy company that's been working us with on this later today, to take all that feedback back to them so that we can get a final version of the raw output that clearly articulates the generic pathway, and Philip has mentioned about genetics being in their research, and those are kind of feedbacks that Retina UK gave us, so we want to make sure that that's included in the various swim lanes and channels that we've got. So where we're at now is we're kind of finishing up the kind of raw kind of data review, with the hope that now, because we have pretty much, I'm going to say this, I think we've got enough support behind this to say that we will take it to that next stage, which means that we will kind of try and take that model, that raw output, and put it into some kind of meaningful, digestible kind of literature and material, so that we can share it much wider. So in the first quarter of this year, we're looking at creating a more digestible document for both patients and our sector as a whole. At the same time, we have been looking at a digital prototype. We know that digital is upon us, and that NHS are looking at various new digital ways of working. So we have been exploring different concepts and functions around how we potentially could support a patient through a digital kind of pathway of support, so that they get the right support, so it's not necessarily reliant on Google. So that's something that we're exploring as well. And then I think what we've been talking with some of the key partners like UKOA, the Royal College, the Clinical Council, is about a potential creation of a small cross-sector working group, really to take this piece of work forward so that it can land right with our respected ICSs, ICBs, or our respected colleagues in the nations as well, so that we can really take it to this next stage. So that's a whirlwind tour of what we've been doing around this eye care support pathway piece. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. And I think that we'll be having a presentation from Pete Thompson from Moorfields to look at the Moorfields patient portal and just see, you know, what one way in which you can make this electronic. But I think for me, what I really like is, because it was really complex, wasn't it, this, when it first started, and I remember that meeting in November, December, and trying to sort of kind of describe what the support was. I think one really great thing from this is you've boiled it down to the absolute essentials, which are you've got to understand the pathway and the process, how the healthcare system works, and to be able to navigate it. You then want to know about actually what's wrong with you and how you treat it, the clinical stuff, but you also want to know about the support and the well-being and all the rest of it. And that is it in a nutshell, isn't it, really? So I think even just having boiled down and a reminder to people who interact with patients, it's not just the eye conditioning treatment that people want. This other stuff, there's 3 arms to what people need to know, and you can't just concentrate, because we do tend to kind of go, oh, patient information, I'll give them a leaflet about glaucoma, great, job done. And it's wider than that. And I think the other thing that was interesting to me about that work was hearing from patients and patient groups about when they need support, which is like the whole thing. So again, I think, you know, if you don't sort of think about it much as sort of clinicians, and actually the whole process is geared towards, we probably don't tell you much until you've been to the hospital a couple of times, and then we've decided we know what's wrong with you. And at that point, just possibly, you might get some information, and you might get a bit more information when you're registered. But actually it's that bit, or first of all, you probably need a bit of information before you go anywhere near anyone, because you need to know that actually it's quite important to look after your eyes and prevent things. It's important to go to an optometrist, because that is where your sight test is, where people will find that there's something that might need sorting out. And that from the point of referral, again, people need that information immediately. Somebody said you might have glaucoma, and they're sitting there, you know, chewing their nails going, oh my God, nobody's got in touch, and am I going blind, you know, all this sort of thing. So it's like the whole sort of pathway. So I think that they're things that I think of already really useful outputs of making everyone aware of that. I think for me, and this is a very long way of asking you a question, for me it's this bit about, I think it'd be great to bring out a document and resources, but we already have to a certain extent resources. It's about embedding them, isn't it? And that is the bit, and I don't know whether you think digital is the solution. How do we actually make that a routine part of the process, rather than constantly relying on either the patient's got to be savvy enough to push for it, or the clinician has got to be savvy and not too busy to remember to do it. So what do you think about that aspect?
Yeah, and I think we said it on one of the slides. It's got to be inherent of the system, isn't it? That clinical journey. And when we've got, you know, we have got some successes, and we know where we've got ECLO embedded, you know, in various trusts. You know that experience is very different, but it needs to be at every stage. And I know Declan will be talking about some of the work around CVI and just actually that handoff between somebody being certified and then going into social care. So we are testing different models and different approaches, because it isn't just about a digital solution. I think, you know, it was quite clear that people want an omni-channel approach, so it'd be face-to-face or literature still, leaflets, you know. So it's but what we need to do is start, I think, overlaying this support pathway against some of the key clinical pathways. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is there's a digital program of work that's taking place. You know, one of the things we're looking at doing is how can we overlay the support pathway against those pathways to make sure that it's embedded at the design stage, because too often it's bolted on. It's a bit of an afterthought, and that's something that we need to try and make sure, so that as we progress on this journey, that it's just there and people get access to it, whether that be a direct referral or whatever. You know, it's got to be embedded.
Yeah, it's got to be business as usual. Just and obviously you were mentioning about the by the way, I do just want to say to people, by the way, we've noticed that for reasons that I think we're not quite sure, we seem to not be able to see the chat function in this meeting. So really sorry if people are, I know Carrie's been trying to sort of solve that, but if people are trying to use the chat, and I know that Roxanne, who's on the call, was wanting to share something in the chat, and we can work out how to do that afterwards, Roxanne, but apologies if people are trying to use it and can't see it, but obviously we've still got the hand raised function. Yes, I just wanted to let people know about. But Rob, you were saying obviously you're wanting to do a sort of a multidisciplinary kind of cross-sector working group. Will there be a point at which people might be able to volunteer to be involved in some way, and how might people are interested or would like to help? How might they seek to do that? And
so like I said, we've already been engaged with key partners anyway. So we've already got a list of people who have inputted into this work. So we'll be, approaching those organisations, asking for representation. I would like somebody to kind of represent the UKOA as well, in that as well. So we're just working up the kind of governance around that and making sure that it's, it is something that is needed, and that what are the rhythms and routines around it in terms of getting something from this raw data to something that's more meaningful for the sector. So yeah, we will be reaching out to key people, mainly through the people that we've already engaged, because as you know, if we have 20 people, we'll just never get anywhere with this. So we need to kind of make sure that we've got the right people in the room.
Fine. Well, we hope to keep all the members posted, so that's great. And who seems to be on to Pete, who's a regular, I think now, it's fair to say, at the UKOA. And we put a call out on the basis of the RNIB's work with the sector and all the discussions about whether this involved a digital patient portal of some sort. We put a call out through the UKOA to ask which hospitals have a patient portal of this sort or something similar, just to try and not reinvent the wheel. So Pete's kindly agreed to come on and talk about the Moorfields patient portal, so we can see what's already out there and whether or not that some version of this might be a way in which we can fulfill some of the ambitions of what Rob's described. So Pete, thanks very much for coming, and I think you're going to share your own slides, aren't you?
Yeah, I wasn't organised enough to do them in advance, so yeah, sharing my own slides. And I actually decided on this to take a little bit of a step back just from the sort of specifically Moorfield side and look at patients' portals more generally. So I've been involved with them in a few ways. First of all, by the Moorfields work, which is predominantly focused on the administrative side of helping patients in terms of appointment. Also in North Central London, at an ICS level, there's a separate drive to bring in a shared care record, which has many of the functions of a patient portal. Also through national work, I've come across work sort of on the NHS app, and as a patient as well, I'm using various different patient portals. So what I thought might be helpful was to take a little bit of a step back from anything too specific. In terms of what a patient portal can do, there is no specific definition for it. And there's a whole huge set of functionalities that a patient portal could deliver. Included in that are some clear things that keep a patient posted about their clinical process. So accessing their medical notes, seeing their letters, seeing summaries of the information that various different organisations have stored about them. So, active medication lists, allergies, stuff like that. Seeing investigations and results. There's sometimes a more active element to it, so messaging the care team, sending a message to either their individual consultant or to the department that's looking after them, doing things like requesting repeat prescriptions. On the administrative side, things like viewing upcoming appointments, receiving reminders, viewing schedules. Patient education material, that often falls under the hat of a patient portal as well, and through to much more complex things, so the ability to upload information that's been taken from home monitoring. So I regularly upload via AccuRx to Babylon Health, who are my GP providers, my blood pressure, for example, via forms there. There's all sorts of forms you can stick in there, pre-assessment for surgery and the like. And increasingly, some of these portals will sort of start integrating with things like Apple Health, which allows them to then receive sort of heart rate information and stuff like that. So all of that stuff from my watch automatically seems to make its way into Babylon, for example. So what is a patient portal? No single definition. Historically, I think it's been defined by the products that were available. And we've seen a few different product categories that are gradually sort of moving together towards a few which are sort of moving towards trying to be a unified solution that do all of those things. So the Moorfields approach was via doctor-doctor, and that started off very much as an administrative system designed to support patient booking, patient reminders, reduce DNAs. I'll briefly touch on personal health records, which need to be linked into NHS systems to be particularly useful. We've then got portals that are deeply linked to an electronic patient record. Epic is the sort of classic example of that. The NHS app, which provides a slightly different approach, and then I'll just briefly mention some niche solutions. All the images, I haven't really pushed the boat out on slide design here, but I thought I'd put a few images in just to make it a little bit less black texty on white background. These are some screenshots from the doctor-doctor website. They're our NHS, they're our patient portal provider. And really what we do there is really very heavily focused on reducing non-attendance by messaging, allowing patients to see digital versions of their upcoming appointment letters and thereby reducing costs. So solutions in that category really do focus very much on patient appointments, and they try to appeal to sort of operations departments in hospitals. And the appeal is in reducing the cost of sending letters. So the hospitals say, right, well, I can save £100,000 a year on stamps by delivering this digitally, and also reducing the number of non-attended appointments, although the evidence isn't always perfect, that these definitely lead to significant reductions in DNA. There's probably multiple different approaches that would be needed at the same time. The systems need to appeal to hospital administrators and operations, and they need tight linkage with hospital patient administration systems. So if these are a third-party bolted-on piece of software, it needs to be tightly linked in with all those hospital systems that are going to do the appointment administration. And the result of that is usually the bottom bit, which is that these are procured very much on a hospital by hospital basis. Because their functionality is so reliant on things that are specific to the hospital, namely appointments, that means that they don't typically cover multiple different hospitals within a single environment. So you tend to be interacting with a single organisation. Things like doctor-doctor, they are gradually adding more non-admin functions. So PIF, who's gone in there recently, will be able to do, I think they put video consultations in. So there are more clinical functionality. So these aren't staying within their silo of admin functionality. The second group, and I've taken some photos here from the Patient Knows Best website, that's the sort of personal health record that seems to have the highest penetration. This one has also been sort of spreading in terms of its functionality, but it lets you do things like looking at records of what your blood pressure was over time, seeing your care plan. But where it's been quite successful is in selling itself to lots of different hospitals, direct to patients, and to integrated care systems as well. So various ICSs have en bloc essentially gone with Patient Knows Best. These systems, so these personal health records, they can store information from multiple different providers. So that includes health records, summaries, etc. They can typically support patients to upload their own data as well. They can have very wide coverage because it can be to some extent patient driven. That they can support upload of data to hospitals, so via web forms. If the hospital is set up to be able to receive information from these systems as well as send information out to the systems, you can use it to do things like proms and prems and things like that. They're typically less focused on appointment management. I haven't caught up with Patient Knows Best recently, but I know historically they didn't see their view as trying to force out of the market all those other platforms that are there for appointment arrangements. They typically focus more on the personal health record rather than the administration side. Again, the financial case for a procuring hospital is typically based around cost reduction of letter sending. So if you get a good number of your patients onto a portal like this, you can send the letter digitally, and then typically, and it's similar with doctor-doctor, they run a system where if the patient opens the letter within 48 hours, then you don't send a physical copy. But if the patient hasn't opened the letter 48 hours after it was uploaded to the system, then a physical copy gets sent. And the strength of this is combining data from lots of different sources. The next category and is one that sort of Epic is the classic example of. And this is where you have your patient portal that is very, very tightly linked to your EPR. And I think it's called My Chart in the big mega suite option Epic. It is a really great example of this. It has got some really, really brilliant functionality in. The strength of this approach is if you have a single piece of software that's doing everything in your hospital, then you can make a lot of that functionality available via your patient portal if the patient portal is part of your software. So what does that mean? It means that in this solution, you know, this is just a screenshot of their main website for My Chart, but it's showing, you know, for example, the one in the green on the left is getting your health information in there, sharing your record below it, but it also includes the appointment scheduling and things like video consultations. So it moves across those different categories, including a bit of what's personal health record, a bit of the administration, a bit of the information, that kind of thing. So you can get this very wide functionality, but the downside is that it's intrinsically linked to a single in-hospital system. So any part of your care that isn't taking part on that system won't be included in the portal unless you've gone to Herculean efforts to start integrating systems from multiple providers. So it doesn't play well with the desire to cover patient needs across lots of different providers and sectors. It'll do a really good job for one provider. And if those providers work together, if all the Epic providers work together, they could pool their data and that would be great as well. But it doesn't play very well with things like shared care records being implemented across wider geographies. The NHS app is a really interesting one, and this is sort of where I'd place my money as being what goes forward. So I'll give my personal view on the last slide. Now, the NHS app does some stuff internally. So some of the things you see when you go onto the NHS app are being done by the NHS app. Other things are being done by integration. So I signed up a few years ago for a Patient Knows Best account when I was having a look at them, and I totally forgot I had it. I'm a pretty simple patient. I've got high blood pressure, which means I occasionally have blood tests done via my GP provider, which is a virtual one. The blood test went via Imperial, and I got a message saying there was a blood test waiting for me on my Patient Knows Best account. I'd completely forgotten I had a Patient Knows Best account, but what was nice was that blood test was then automatically available on the NHS app, because Patient Knows Best have integrated with the NHS app, and you can then access the information in your Patient Knows Best account, and it looks like you're still on the NHS app. It's kind of white labeled underneath there. So you're delivering functionality of an external platform within the NHS app. And that's a really nice approach, because it potentially means we could have a single source of truth for lots of different bits of information. But that potentially comes at a disadvantage. It's easy to get information into an external system. It's harder to drive hospital-specific functionality through an external system. So it's easy to get all of our letters from different providers on the NHS app. You can imagine with time, it's going to be harder to do appointment arrangements through the NHS app, where individual hospitals might have a variety of different PAS systems. And then on top of that, there's a whole melee of other systems that do some part of the patient portal. So at Moorfields, we use Doctor to do our appointment arrangement, and we're starting to do some PIFU and starting to move into some clinical bits on it. But there are things it doesn't do. So we have a separate platform which we do for remote consent. And if you think about the digital perioperative pathway, there's very few solutions that cover everything. Because if you want to go fully digital on that, unless you've got sort of, you know, a big mega suite like Epic, which I think probably does all of it, you need one platform for remote consent. You probably need another platform to do your pre-assessment. You probably have a third platform to do your video and telephone consultations. If you're interested in prehabilitation, that might be another one. It might be bundled with the other. Probably it isn't integrated with a hospital PAS system, so you need something else to do the appointment scheduling. Maybe it does PROMs and PREMs, or maybe you do it via doctor. So all of these other little bits of functionality are often driven by niche solutions. And the end result of that, and this is my last slide, which is the fundamental question for me is how many portals do we want? And we need to bear in mind that we're terribly invested in what we do because it's what we do all day, every day. But our patients may be seeing 4 different hospitals, a GP provider, they may be under multiple different community-based care settings. So they might potentially have a situation where they would need to log on to 15 different portals to manage their care. It's not impossible. So you've got the sort of 2 ends of the spectrum. You could have many portals that are tailored for specific purposes, specific specialties, or specific scenarios. Or you can have a single portal that is less tailored to individual needs, but avoids the needs for the user to sign on to multiple platforms. And that, for example, that was great for me when I realized I didn't need to try and find my Patient Knows Best password. I could just get it via the NHS app. From my personal perspective, and as a patient with very, very simple needs, I am totally not interested in having to log on to 15 different services and try and remember which one I have to go to for which bit. What I want is a key functionality in a single place, regardless of the provider, regardless of the disease. I'm not really interested in one for my GP and one for my hospitals and one for the NHS. But I acknowledge that I am a very low complexity patient. I just need blood pressure pills, and it might be very different if I have a chronic disease that the sort of, is much more prominent in my life, and there I might be more interested in it. So my personal view is that it's great to have all this functionality, but my personal opinion is that it all needs to get together in one place so it's well signposted, and I kind of hope the NHS app can be that thing where even if hospitals procure lots of different things, we have hundreds of portals, we can surface the most relevant information in one place and try and make it a little bit less driven by our desires to create something really special and clever, and more by the fact that actually it's far more pragmatic to have a single point of entry. But views will differ. That's the end of my talk.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Pete. I mean, I don't know, again, it'd be interesting to hear from Rob in a minute, having now heard all that, what you think. But while you mull over that, I mean, I would have thought anybody would want one-stop shop, wouldn't you? I mean, people value simplicity, and you don't want to have to be, the system is already difficult enough to navigate as it is. If you have multiple different things, even if it's just one entry point that can then take you to different systems, that's okay. But I think having multiple places to go is just sort of defeating the object. Pete, given that you still, I think, work with NHS England, don't you? In the sort of eye care thing. How likely is it? I think the answer is going to be negative, but how likely is it that actually this will be developed as a national one-stop shop? Because there seems to be a real reluctance to attempt to do anything nationally, given everyone was traumatized by the, one NHS, that MPS fit or whatever it's called, the one system for all. Nobody seems to want to do anything nationally anymore because of that. But what do you think?
I think the NHS app was on the chopping block pre-COVID. I remember there being conversations about what its future was, and then COVID came along, and because of the sort of, not the COVID passports, whatever it was called, it ended up with something like an 80% engagement rate in London, so huge numbers of users. So it seems to be very firmly established as part of the future. The fact, I think it could happen fairly naturally that becomes a single point of access where more specialist systems feed into it. So doctor, I believe, are in the process of getting into the NHS app. It may have happened already. Patient Knows Best have already done it. So I think these individual providers will see that it's going to probably be, a requirement that their customers ask for, that their apps will essentially be surfaced through the NHS app. Now, it might be that to get to more specific functionality, you need to leave the NHS app environment and go out to there. So like you say, signposting, but to get the key bits of information you need from these different sources in one place. And I think, with anything we do in eye care, it would be wise to try and follow that same approach, which is we can develop something very specific with lots of functionality, but we should make sure that it also plays nicely with the NHS app. So yeah, maybe the more engaged patients can drop off into a specific piece of software or get signposted to it from the NHS app. But for the larger group of patients who are just having a cataract operation and then disappear off into the sunset, or who have a more minor condition with their eye, but they don't think about that much, allowing them to do it via a single point of access that they use for their primary care would seem to be very sensible.
Thank you. Stephen, have you a question?
Thanks. Yeah, Stephen Scowcroft from the Macular Society. Peter, thanks for that. I just wondered whether, obviously, one of the biggest challenges is actually delivering some of these to people with sight loss, and AMD, etc., is a key part of that. And obviously, cataracts, etc., is something it's the sight loss bit of it is something that's very temporary. But with all of these portals and with all of these areas, we know that there's still challenges with people receiving letters that they can't access. So how are we kind of ensuring that we're not adding on more complexity, more difficulty, more kind of inequality with that digital divide with the kind of portal, and getting that balance right? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I get challenged all the time about using digital stuff and the risk of exclusion. It goes beyond just, site-based exclusion right through to sort of socio-economic and sort of, digital literacy and stuff like that. I think it's going to be impossible to have a single solution that is maximally accessible to all groups. So we're on a hiding to nothing if we try and say we only want one solution. We're going to go digital, because we're always going to exclude some people by doing that. Because the fact of the matter is, not all services are going to be really well designed with best accessibility standards. There'll be some that are really good, some that aren't so great, and others that just don't have the budget to really design a really highly accessible interface. So I think the key with all this digital stuff is to make sure that you're not doing it at the expense of other channels. Rob's mentioned an omni-channel approach. So, and I think that's the way to do it, to say that with your digital channels, you need to make them maximally accessible, and there are things you can do. And also bearing in mind that people with vision loss who are very expert with their devices will use a lot of tools that aren't at all related to your digital solution. But actually, sometimes you can do a really badly designed website, but their screen readers rescue you or something like that. So you try and do the best you can, but I think you should never do it to the expense of other channels, other ways of accessing the same information. Because you're inevitably going to exclude a group of people if you only allow them to access their care information digitally. Yeah, so I mean, I don't have a great answer for it, except that, you know, do the best you can with digital and not to the exclusion of other ways of doing things.
Thanks.
I think it's a very good point. Rob.
Yeah, just quickly, you know, one of the things that we've been working with NHS Digital on, and specifically the app team, Helen's been doing quite a bit of work with the team, Owen and the team around the NHS app, and around actually increasing the kind of user group. So having more blind and visually impaired people involved in that kind of user kind of testing and functionality and things like that of the app. So we've been doing quite a bit of work, well, Helen has, to try and increase the kind of people that help out in some of that beta testing, etc. Because and the other thing that we've been doing is kind of looking at the app a bit more closely, the NHS app, and you know, my understanding is that it's still heavily reliant on GP coding and pulling codes from GP. So one of the big things we've been discussed is around, and probably leads in nicely to Declan, is the CVI. You know, the CVI had actually got a GP code linked to it, but how many patients get access to that CVI information and data, you know, through the app, and it doesn't, you know, so there's a whole host of discussions that we've been having with the NHS Digital guys around that, some of that functionality and what we could improve. And the other thing is just the kind of support function within the NHS app. There's so much support in there, you know, about all our, you know, the support that's available. But as a patient, you have to have an understanding of your diagnosis, your needs, because you have to go and search for it. It doesn't create it's not an algorithm based. So if it pulls from your GP record that says you've got, say, glaucoma, it doesn't pre-populate support around glaucoma. You've got to still then go and do a search for that information. So there's all things like that we've been engaging with the app team at NHS England to try and improve some of that. So just to say that there is stuff going on to try and improve that. Thank you.
That's great. And I think that's the way it gets in bed, isn't it? We take advantage of all these, if the information is there, all we then have to do is get the algorithms to, you know, connect point A with information B, and it starts to be embedded. Anyway, that's really interesting. Thank you very much, and thanks, Pete. So I'm going to move on now to Declan, who's already given us a little hint of his slides. So Declan, thanks very much for coming, and you're going to talk to us about CVI and data, and I'm going to hopefully now reshare the slides. So just bear with me for a moment. Okay.
Thank you all for inviting me to this, and apologies to Bill and Melanie, who probably heard it before. Next slide, please. So I thought we would summarize the purpose of the certificate of vision impairment, because it does two things which always causes confusion. Number one, it offers advice and support to visually impaired individuals, a pathway for that. It notifies the social services, who have a statutory responsibility to provide timely assessment and help. Notifies GPs, which is integrated care, and it also facilitates charities in offering help, and is particularly helpful in getting targeted education assistance to families. Its other purpose is it provides a reasonable estimate of the causes of visual impairment in the UK, in Scotland, in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, the system doesn't provide central information. at the moment. It's done by local, it gives the information by local authority and hospitals, by nations and regions, and it particularly documents changes in the causes of visual impairment. If things are changing, it will alert to that. It also is used to guide investment in services to patients and guide investment in research into the causes of visual impairment. And it was helpful when this country chucked money at genetics in about 2013 to be able to demonstrate that that genetic diseases were a significant cause of visual impairment and rising. It also provides information on the main. It also provides information on the main causes of visual impairment for a thing called the Public Health Outcomes Framework, which is a statutory requirement of the Department of Health. They have to publish the main causes of visual impairment every year, and the only way they can get that is a CVI system, and that's one of the reasons why they keep funding it. But one can never take this funding for granted, which I think may need to be discussed later. Next slide, please. The strengths of the vision impairment CVI system are that it provides a useful estimate of main causes of visual impairment. It's good information on changes. It also has information on variation in visual impairment due to ethnicity, deprivation, age, sex, and geographic factors, which are quite important. Demonstrates that if there's a large number of people visually impaired in one region compared to another, it usually means there's something wrong and something can be done about it. It has demonstrated the rise in recorded inherited eye disease in the past 10 or 15 years, and it's cost effective at about 80,000 a year. Its weaknesses: it serves two masters. It offers help to patients. It's a pathway for help to patients, but it provides national and local data collection, and those two things are quite different. It is not a national visual impairment eye survey. That would require a specific, essentially large research study funded by the NHS or welcome. It's voluntary. It relies on ophthalmologists and patients, it underestimates the numbers of patients who would benefit from being registered, from being certified. There's been a good audit in WOFAs that confirms that, and there's also been a good publication in the BM in the BJO last November demonstrating that the numbers of patients visually impaired from diabetic retinopathy is probably underrepresented. There are reasons for that, which I'll come to later. There are delays in certification. There are delays in getting local authority assessment and help, and fundamentally the whole system is still too paper-based. It was paper-based in 1851 when this country started recording visual impairment. It's still paper-based. Next, please. Again, this just for information. It demonstrates the numbers of the rates per. It's about 25,000 a year, of which over 10,000 are due to age-related macular degeneration, dry and wet. You can see the dip in registrations due to COVID from April 2020, and the significant rise, and it's come back to normal since. The other three are plotted here. Green is glaucoma, stable at about 2,000 a year. Red is hereditary eye disease, and just below that, diabetic eye disease. There are 101 other causes of visual impairment, making up the remaining 10,000 or so. But it's so that the visual impairment in the country is 25,000 new patients a year. It's certainly more than that, but it isn't. We have no evidence it's rising. Next, please. To improve the quality of the data in the service to visually impaired individuals, we have a number of suggestions. One is to train optometrists and ophthalmic nurses to sign the CVIs. Two is explore the development of a national portal so clinicians in all eye units can upload CVI data directly to the to the database. Sorry?
I think so somebody wasn't muted, Declan. Can everyone just make sure they mute? Thanks. Do carry on.
Run a pilot scheme to inform patients and carers of the benefits that they should be receiving following certification, and that this pilot would include an audit of what benefits the patients have received 3 months later from their authority, because we don't know. We know that's not as good as it should be, but we don't know the details. Next, please. Next, please. So taking point one first, training optometrists and ophthalmic nurses to sign CVIs. The 1948 National Health Act states that only ophthalmologists, those rarefied beasts, can sign CVIs. This is based on the concept that only ophthalmologists have the knowledge to diagnose and assess visual impairment accurately. That may have been true in the 50s, but it isn't now. It's no longer correct, as many optometrists and ophthalmic nurses can diagnose and assess visual impairment for all the main causes. Inherited retinal disease, uveitis, and neuro are probably slightly different, and they do require some medical input. I have to say, even the most well-informed ophthalmologists frequently can't give a definitive diagnosis in some of those areas. We need evidence of safety and efficacy before we support this major change in practice. So it requires a large formal clinical trial, preferably with NHS portfolio adoption. The proof of principle was provided by a small study on 40 patients in Wales, which proves it works. But I don't really think you can change national policy on the basis of one 40-patient study. But it is proof of the principle. The research questions are: what additional training and assessment is required by optometrists and ophthalmic nurses to detect and certify people as visually impaired? It needs to confirm equivalent accuracy, as it did in Wales, and it needs an early pilot to demonstrate that switching to this system would result in reduction in delays and improve patient satisfaction stroke experience. We have Roxanne Crosby-Nash has submitted a grant application to the Macular Society for a significant sum to run this as a formal trial with portfolio adoption. So we await the outcome of that submission, which has got through the first round. So in some months' time, we'll know whether that can start. Next slide, please. Moving on to a national portal. CVIs are currently submitted to the CVI office by all over the country. 25% come by post, 75% by PDFs on emails. The PDFs are slowly rising. Electronic medical records have CVI pages to facilitate this. That's Open Eyes, Medisoft, and others. Moorfields has an automated system where when a Moorfields ophthalmologist completes a CVI form, that is, as soon as they press send, that is automatically transferred to the CVI office desk, which speeds things up, and we may need to see if that can be done from all over the country. The data is then transcribed onto a national database, which leads to delays. Hospitals tend to bunch and send 100 CVIs in one go once every 6 months, which sometimes is not good practice. Any transcription involves errors, and also copying stuff from one database to another is not good use of staff time. The RNIB IT development team has agreed to review the current CVI database system to see to evaluate its feasibility of developing a national portal from it. This is a major IT project which will require a business case, and significant investment will be required. Where this investment comes from is debatable, but it could be argued the sector of the visual charities, of the vision charities, could consider it, and then we need to demonstrate that it leads to major improvements in data quality, service to patients, and reduction in delays. So that's our plan at the moment. The RNIB IT development team is looking at how we could do it. If necessary, we may look at doing it in stages and do it as a pilot, or do only parts of it to demonstrate its feasibility. Next, please. This is a pilot scheme based on some work done in Manchester by I think Henshaw's was the group. Rob Cooper was heavily involved, and I think Bill's aware of it. The plan is to pilot it at 3 eye units, and we would identify all the patients who have CVIs in say a 3-month period in those units. We would inform them of the benefits and assessments they should receive. That would be done centrally. They would all get that in an email or to them or their carers. We would then contact those patients 3 months later to confirm that the CVI had been issued, to ask if they'd had a social services assessment, whether they'd accepted it, what help and assistance they'd been offered or received, and whether what they had received either from local authorities or from the charitable sector. So I think this could relatively easily be done with the assistance of the charitable sector in a fairly straightforward way. Next, please. So that's the 4 suggestions I have that we should seriously consider to improve the data quality of the CBI system and improve the service to patients at the same time. So I'd welcome thoughts. It is important that we're seen to be moving this forward to ensure that the Department of Health continues to fund it. Just on a point of detail, seeing as we're an all UK organisation, Wales and Welsh data comes into the CBI office in Moorfields. Northern Ireland data is run separately to the same standards and the same forms, and give very similar results to what we get in the rest of England. If anything, the data from Northern Ireland is probably better in other places because it's a very tightly run system. And Scotland has a good system for connecting with local authorities, but there's no central data collection at the moment, and we're meeting them next week to see if we can help to get it restarted. So I'll finish and look for questions.
Excellent, thank you very much, Declan. That was really interesting. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, and by the way, just while we're thinking about that, although we don't have a chat function, people will see there is a Q&A function, and the bar at the top, so people can put thoughts in the Q&A bit if they want to. So I mean, my first question, Declan, is, if nobody's putting their hand up at the moment, is, so is this all broadly going to have to be dependent on charity funding, or is there actually going to be some more formal support for this, do you think?
In the short term, the likelihood of significant NHS investment in this is, in the current climate, small. To be perfectly honest, the money is going to, as I said, to ambulances, staffing, and other things at the moment.
Okay, so it's really about proving the principle. I mean, I certainly think it's an absolute no-brainer to have other clinical professionals able. I mean, if they're able to sort of care and make decisions for patients, really, why shouldn't they be able to do this? In my experience, the nurses are actually far better at spotting which patients are eligible in the first place and reminding the doctors to do it, and it does spread the load. And for many patients, the actual completion of the form is actually pretty easy. You know, you tick the diagnosis, you fill in the patient details. It's quite straightforward, I think, isn't it? Rob, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to come in on that bit. I was going to come in on, like, some of the things that we found around the GM working. Yes, I think it's interesting. One of the reasons we want to look at working with the National CBI team to kind of send out information about the benefits was because, as part of the GM work, we very much identified that patients didn't understand the benefits of certification, the benefits of the benefits of registration post certification, and didn't understand the difference between the two, didn't really understand the support that they were entitled to, whether that be things like welfare benefit support, etc. So but I think the challenge we had, and we worked with Manchester Business School to look at the feasibility of doing something similar on the Manchester model across 42 ICSs. That would cost a hell of a lot of money and necessarily wouldn't be viable at this stage, and we need more evidence. So that's one of the reasons we kind of approached Declan to say, look, these are the kind of findings that we've found on the back of the work in Manchester. We've very much identified that there is a need to better inform patients around that certification piece. So hence why we wanted to do something with the national team. I suppose we're still number crunching and looking at the data to see which are the best geographical locations that we could select for those pilots. So I know Declan's been putting feelers out in terms of people that might be interested, but that'd be, I think, something that would be keen if partners are interested in working with the team. And we're also working with the third sector partners like Visionary to just do a bit of review of where the support is, etc. And also ECLO support as well, because I think we're going to hear later that ECLO are very much part of the whole CVI process as well. So I think that, you know, we've got some great insight. The actual evaluation for the GM work is near on ready to be shared at some point. Helen's been working that evaluation up with Henshaw, so that's got some interesting findings from that. Just to give you an insight of where that's come from.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think if there aren't any further questions at this point, then let's move seamlessly on to ECLO. So I'm just going to hopefully reshare the.
I think Declan's coming back in.
Slides.
I think Declan wants to come back in.
Did you want to say something?
There is a question from Sharon Beckett.
Oh, sorry.
Why do you think the data has been static for so long when we have an aging population and most conditions are more prevalent in older people? This could be due to inadequate, incomplete registration or reporting. But having said that, that error would be constant. One of the reasons is that there is evidence that the injection program for AMD in particular is now particularly effective, and it does appear to be paying off for older people. That's the number of people with AMD is dropping slowly, and that is probably due to effective treatments, and also which compensates to some extent for the undoubtedly rising population. But it won't affect patients with geographic atrophy who will have dry macular degeneration, who will have to wait for the new generation of genetic-based injections, which will come over the next 5 years. So that's my comment on it as to why it's stable. And also with diabetics, although there is an element of underreporting, diabetic eye disease treatments with screening, detection, good control of blood sugar, and injections is very, very effective, and that's been shown in multiple really quite high quality studies. So that's why diabetics is dropping. Glaucoma is stable, but we could do a lot better with glaucoma if the existing treatments were made available to people earlier, which comes back to screening and detection. So I think that hopefully that gives you some awareness of it, of Sharon, of what we think.
I think it's always going to be one of these things that, because it is, as you say, because of the flaws we have and the potential variability in reporting, it's really difficult, isn't it, actually, to make any conclusions. But I think all the changes that you're describing, Declan, would make it more reliable, at least. And eventually, maybe we'll have algorithms that can simply pull this out of an EPR and identify people through their visual fields and their visual acuities. You know, this could all potentially be automated if we all had electronic records, but I think maybe a little bit of a pipe dream. Anyway, so let's say I'll just start the slides, and hopefully you can all gosh, every time I restart them I have to flip through again, so apologies for this. Just I'm sure this is not a good use of our time, is it? Should be slicker. Right. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome Caroline and Kathy to talk to us about the ECLO role. So thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. And I'll warn you now that after 19 years of presenting to blind and partially sighted people, I'm not a great user of slides, so I'm bound to make forget to tell you to move on, so I'll try my best. I'm Caroline Chamberlain. I'm head of eye care support at RNIB, and over the last 8 years I've led the development of the ECLO service. The purpose of our presentation, and it follows on brilliantly from Declan's, is to take you through the key findings from a recent certification survey which our team undertook in September with around 90 ECLOs from across the UK. So that's RNIB, NHS and third sector ECLOs. So in a moment, I'll pass across to Kathy Burke to do the really interesting bit. Kathy was an ECLO herself for 17 years, one of our first, and has been an ECLO service manager as well as our subject lead for certification for the last 7 years. But before I do that, I'm just going to set the scene. I'm going to take you through the current ECLO coverage and what led us to carrying out the survey in the first place. So next slide, please. So today RNIB employs, in actual fact, 117 ECLOs. So that's a bit of a successful recruitment since the slides were produced. And that's supporting patients over almost 210 sites of 102 hospital trusts. That does include locum ECLO cover as well. There's also 38 ECLOs that are employed by NHS and sector partners. Our RNIB ECLOs will support over 50,000 patients this year and over 12,000 relatives. Now, for all of those people, we collect rafts of data, not least to inform the importance of ECLO provision, but also to understand what patient wants, needs, and impact of the service is. Next slide, please. So as part of the ECLO's work, and as advised in the quality framework and the good practice guidelines for certification, as well as the UKOA patient standards, the ECLOs are an integral cog in that certification machine. And Kathy will talk more about the impact that the role has within that part of the pathway. 9,000 of the patients that our ECLOs will support this year are also supported through the CVI process. And so really progressing that the patient side of the CVI and into statutory services as quickly as possible. Part of the data we captured told us that 33% of these CVIs are being identified and initiated by the ECLO themselves. So the ECLO's observing the needs of the patient, observing the visual fields and the acuities, and going back to the ophthalmologist for them to consider authorization to certify. And that varies, but one of our sites, actually, we know that percentage is somewhere up near 70% of the CVIs are being initiated by the ECLO. We know that Wales and Northern Ireland have got 100% ECLO coverage, and Scotland is well on its way with 93%. There are still 20 of the top 100 ophthalmology departments in England that still have no ECLO. So we have to presume to some extent that means that possibly 33% of patients are not being certified who could be. So we wanted to know, sorry, next slide, please. We wanted to know why that might be. What are the ECLO's experiences of the challenges within the CVI pathway? And that's what led to the survey that Kathy will now take us through, why we did it and the main findings. Kathy.
Next slide, please. So I thought I'd start by just outlining for you that CVIs is really only part of the ECLO role. The core activities of an ECLO, predominantly it's emotional support for patients and information giving, making quality referrals to sensory partners, advocating for patients, supporting and understanding eye conditions and treatment and compliance. So, you know, this ties in really nicely with the presentations we've had from Retina UK, from Seeability, and also just that whole idea of supporting people to be good with their treatments so that their vision doesn't progress. We're good at identifying need. We make referrals and have professional networks and relationships beyond the eye clinics. So CVI is just the one part of what the ECLOs do. And what we know from the data that we've collected from the patients we've supported this year is 42% of the ECLO, of the support provided was to patients who weren't yet eligible for certification. So it's early intervention, it's early support, and that's, you know, what we would aim for. Next slide, please. There are some additional sort of activities that ECLOs get involved in: visual awareness training, induction with new staff in departments, participating in clinical audits and governance, promoting eye disease support groups, working with Glaucoma UK Macular Society to promote those groups within the hospital trusts, promoting peer support. You know, all things that we've heard are so valuable to patients from the other presenters today. But also we participate in falls prevention strategies and teams because sight loss is so relevant to those things. But another thing, just one of the things that is an additional activity, is assisting departments to evaluate and improve the CVI process. So what did our ECLOs tell us about the CVI pathway from their trusts. And I would just add and sort of underline that this isn't just RNIB ECLOs. This is ECLOs from across, some NHS ECLOs, some employed by local societies as well. So this is the whole survey went out and canvassed the whole ECLO network. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to say that we all know the Department of Health guidance for a clinical ophthalmologist in England. And the thing it states about the CVI is that it's seen as a significant step in the sight loss pathway, enabling people to access support to help them retain and regain independence. It's one of those steps. Hopefully, those 43% that we're seeing earlier are helping them to retain and regain their independence earlier on. But certainly the CVI helps another group of patients. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we learned was that offering certification as soon as a patient is eligible isn't necessarily happening. 36% of the ECLO respondents recommended that all patients who are eligible should be offered a CVI. And if you move on to the next slide, the NICE guidance states, making a person aware of the benefits associated with a CVI and giving them the choice of having a CVI as soon as they're eligible, rather than waiting for treatment to finish, allows earlier access to services and support. So I think the first thing that the survey identified is that there needs to be an earlier offer of CVI. Consider it more of a passport to information, support, and identification of sight loss, rather than a last resort. Next slide, please. The second key finding was to improve the knowledge and understanding of CVI amongst eye clinic professionals. And I would just underscore that this wasn't consultants particularly, but as you were saying, there's more people involved in the pathway these days. Some patients may never see a consultant ophthalmologist. They might only be seen by a nurse practitioner or by another person in the pathway. So making sure that everybody in the pathway understands the importance of CVI and of social care support is what people are coming up with. So 21% of respondents felt that clinicians' understanding of the CVI process could be improved. And if you move on to the next slide, there's a quote from one ECLO who said, and I think this sort of summarizes up the feelings, awareness of all clinical staff, not just consultants and ophthalmologists. Could we do this by sewing it into their clinical training for those training in the UK and into professional accreditation training for those coming from abroad? I know for a fact, one of the local authorities that I work with, one of the local trusts, they've had 4 or 5 new consultant ophthalmologists joining from overseas, and they don't understand the CVI, they don't understand the social care system. So why would they offer it? So is there some way of increasing awareness for these people so that they can support that process efficiently and effectively? And there's high turnover of nursing staff as well, so keeping the knowledge fresh, that needs to be considered. And I think this is something that Declan highlighted too. Next slide, please. The third thing that was identified by the ECLOs was the need for a consistent and clear information for patients around certification. They responded and highlighted the need for consistent and clear messaging about CVI process and benefits. I think, that we do have less people now who say, if you sign this form, you might get some money. But there are still some who say that you'll get financial benefits as the result of a form, and that's not always the case. So I think there may be, this might identify a potential need for a brief explanatory leaflet when a CVI is offered. This is what it's for. Just very simple leaflet. There's also the marketing certification in ophthalmology departments. People don't know to ask for it because there isn't anything in the department that tells them about it. So certainly this is something that I know the College of Ophthalmologists used to have a poster, but that's maybe something that needs to be reviewed. I know there's not, with infection control, we don't loads of things around departments anymore, but there's other ways of promoting things like digital screens, etc. There's also the need for this sort of consistent verbal messaging about a CVI. So, it's better to say it would be beneficial for us to consider registering you as sight impaired because that will help you to access appropriate support and services, rather than saying it will help you to access benefits, for example. So just making that a consistent message. Thank you. Next slide. The fourth thing, and Declan touched on this, is improving timescales for the CVI. The process can be lengthy, and it's not viewed necessarily as a priority by all of the ophthalmology staff. So we know that the Department of Health in England advises that it should be distributed within 5 days. I think you'd be hard pushed to find many trusts who are enabled to get that out within 5 days at present. There can be delays if a CVI is awaiting a consultant's signature, and perhaps that consultant's away on annual leave and there's nobody else to sign. So the thought that other staff might be able to sign it is a way forward for that. There are admin pressures, particularly on the medical secretaries, also on some of the ECLOs. If they're taking on the responsibility of the CVI distribution, and it's not seen necessarily as a priority, they end up with a little pile behind them on the desk. I'll do them in a batch. Well, that delays the access to care. And it means that those CVIs are not reaching their destination to be picked up by social care to offer support. So there needs to be some way of addressing that. And it's complicated too for those who are unable to attend in person, but could benefit from a CVI, those that are housebound, for example, or for patients who are seen in a virtual clinic, but don't actually see an ophthalmologist. And how do you identify what their level of sight is? They're not routinely given a visual acuity test or asked quality of life questions when they go for virtual clinics. So there may be patients who are attending and being screened, but not being asked whether their sight is starting to impact on their everyday life. And the next slide, please. So something else that Declan touched on is just this reliance on paper still. So 83% of our respondents advised that in their department, it's still the paper form that's used, and 88% are completed by hand rather than by computer. Now, there are some riders here because we do have a raft of electronic CVIs, but I would just counter by saying that none of them are accessible for patients. And we are meant to be providing an accessible copy of a CVI to patients. So there needs to be another way, perhaps the paper CVI filled out on a computer, and then you can enlarge it, or you can reduce it, or you can make it into just a text document. But distributing it by email is then much easier if it's been filled out on the computer and saved as a PDF. 72% of departments that responded keep a spreadsheet or an auditable database of the CVIs that they complete in their department. That is a Department of Health recommendation, certainly in England. And so for those other 28%, they don't know how many CVIs they've done in the year. They don't know how many of them are for a diabetic eye condition, for example. So if they're doing some audits, there's no access to that data. So improving the way that we keep a track on the CVIs that are handled in the department would really improve audits and research, but also would help with admin. Has my CVI left the department yet? Oh, I'll look on the spreadsheet. Yes, it has. We sent it on such and such. But otherwise, people have got to go and scrabble around to find notes to speed up these things. Next slide, please. So we do patient experience feedback every year. I'm not going to go through all these because we're limited for time, but I just wanted to list some of the things, and you can read these later of the difference that the ECHO makes. But if you move on to the next slide, please. One of them is that patients appreciate ECHO support with the CVI process. And this is just one quote from the patient experience questionnaire last year. After having contact with the ECHO service, they assessed whether I needed to be registered as sight impaired. When they realised they sorted this out for me. This opened up a whole lot of doors for me. Nobody had ever suggested I should look into becoming registered before the service did. As a result of being registered, I now receive so much more help and support, which I just think highlights one person's experience. So if you have the next slide, please. So just to sort of underscore some of the tasks and responsibilities, according to the guidance, hospitals' tasks or duties is to ensure that the certification is offered to those who are eligible as soon as they meet the guidelines. To distribute the CVIs according to the guidance timescales, that's 5 days in England and Northern Ireland, on the day or as soon after within Wales and within 2 weeks in Scotland. It's also their duty to maintain a record of the CVI and patient notes, and to keep a spreadsheet or database is recommended of all the CVIs progressing through the department, who authorised it, what eye condition, which local authority, etc. Next slide, please. In terms of what the ECLOs will do and assist with in regards to the CVI pathway, invaluable really in terms of explaining the process and the parts of the process. You know, certification happens here, registration happens in the local authority, you'll be offered this, the timescale currently is this. So they can help people to make informed choices. They can initiate the CVI where necessary for a consultant's consideration or another member of the ophthalmic team when that becomes possible. They can also allow a patient some time to think. It's you know, if that's the first time they've heard it, the consultant says, I think it's time to register you sight impaired. They might not want to proceed that day, but the ECLO could allow time to think. They can provide that practical and emotional support alongside the CVI. This is just one part of their journey, and they need to have the rest of their needs identified, and they need to be offered the support that's available to meet those needs and to make an effective referral onto social care so that any urgent needs or risks are highlighted on the CVI. And they can act as an advocate between the eye care, the eye clinic and the external agencies that are delivering the support. Because they've got those good networks, their existing referral partnerships, they can just ensure that the people are identified and brought to the attention of the right parties as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So, you know, we've raised a lot of things, and I don't want this to be a negative thing. I think for a lot of the things that have been raised, you know, like increasing the knowledge of staff in departments, we already have a lot of resources available. There's the sight loss, what we needed to know, and the benefits and concessions of registration. You know, even just giving a copy of this to any member of staff who's coming for induction and asking them to read it and understand it would provide an awful lot of background about the social care system and what's available to people, so that instantly they'd be better aware. We also have an online training module, which is free, which talks about visual awareness, sighted guiding training, the benefits of registration. That can be shared following on from this presentation. There's the benefits and concessions leaflet I mentioned. We have a spreadsheet template that we can share with people if that would be helpful, if they don't already have one in their trust. There's the Sight Advice FAQ website, which was compiled by a number of sight loss charities and provides some basic information for people about eye conditions, about asking for registration, etc. There was the Royal College of Ophthalmologists poster about certification. We're having a look at that to see if we can review it and reissue it. And we'll distribute as well the guidelines on who can be referred to an ECLO. And I would just encourage you to check that the CVI that you use in your department is an accessible version. So go away and check that you're using the latest version from the Department of Health website if you're in England, or from the country's websites, and make sure you can make that accessible to people in their preferred formats. Next slide, please. There's also information and a guidance for clinic staff on the RNIB website. The Macular Society have an excellent page on registering as sight impaired. Glaucoma have a sight loss advice and support page. Retina UK have a registration page. The Stroke Association have a page on vision problems after stroke. There's one for children specifically about advising parents on discussing sight loss with their children, and the Parents Guide. The one I couldn't find, which I thought would be helpful, was Diabetes UK. There's nothing specific related to CVI there. Next slide, please. So what questions should we be considering in our individual departments? Would you consider your department an example of good practice for the CVI on the basis of what we've talked about today? Can you ensure that all new staff in ophthalmology understand the purpose and process for certification? Do you know the processes that are actually in place in your department, how long it's taking to send CVIs, whether they're going in batches to social care or whether they go straight away? What one thing could you do to improve the CVI pathway in your trust? What happens for virtual patients or those who require domiciliary support? And do you ensure your patients are offered and provided an accessible copy? Next slide, please. Any questions?
Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. I do think that, again, it just goes back to this whole any system that relies on either patients knowing they can advocate for themselves or clinicians who, and I think, the graph that Declan was showing about, the registration, I'm sure part of the reason it's dropped off is because everyone's like massively busy now because all the departments are in even more of a crisis than they were before because they're catching up with a massive backlog. And it's stuff like this that gets dropped by the wayside when you're operating in that environment. I do think having a poster, a standard poster and national leaflet would be great. There is a little leaflet, I think, in the back of the forms that I've used, but nobody ever remembers to rip it off, look at it. And it's not particularly pretty looking. I also think that, again, you could potentially use the UKOA to test the materials with not only things people at the Royal College, but a number of providers and get some feedback and get everyone's badge on it. Because if it's co-developed, people have a bit more ownership and perhaps they're a bit more likely to use it. So, but I'd certainly love to see that. Rob, would you like to come in?
Yeah, it's great to see, and I was just thinking, we talk about, yes, we get there's a time scale there, but there's a reality that, and one of the things that we found in Greater Manchester and certainly around Manchester was that although CVIs were getting to social care and getting to rehab teams, we're still looking at many patients waiting up to 3 months for an assessment, and then patients waiting up to 6 to 12 months for any meaningful rehab intervention. So although, it's important to get the process right, there's still a whole other journey in that social care side that still needs to be looked at. And I'm hoping that with, ICS as ICB's integration, that we might be able to have a look at that part of the journey as well. Because yes, it's important to get CVI and registration right, but there's a whole challenge in that other space, which is social care. And I'll be honest, in Greater Manchester, we didn't know what the waiting lists were in rehab, and that's part of what we wanted to try and do, because the hospital have a duty, they refer people on, but then actually we had no knowledge of how long it was taking people to get that rehab support. And actually the reality is, and COVID's probably had an impact on that, people are still waiting months and years for any kind of, and that's all around independence. So there's some real challenges in this whole piece. So I didn't want to, these are evaluation that's coming out from the GM work, which once ensures and everyone's agreed on it, I'm sure we'll be able to come to a future meeting and share some of the in-depth findings linked to that piece of work.
Stephen.
Thanks. Yeah, it's always been a concern of ours generally around the kind of under-reporting and the underestimating, and yet that CVI is really the only kind of consistent data set that we have around causes of visual impairments, etc. So, but things like the NOD, the National Ophthalmology Database, is there any way of kind of joining up some of that data to give a fuller picture? And obviously the CVI is only one aspect of that, but yeah, I know that they're soon to be kind of reporting on their first phase of that, and I think that would be really good to bring a lot of that data together. Hopefully it's already being thought of.
I think that's a good point, and I don't know that there's obviously not so relevant for the cataract audit. The only other audit we currently have is the AMD audit, which is kind of in development, and I'm not completely sure whether or not actually the completeness of your CVI is part of the audit, but certainly something that could potentially take back to Martin McKibben as the chair of that, just to see is that that included? Because where you have that data and you can assess people against it, it's quite powerful. Declan.
Yes, the AMD database, which had its first, I think it's just finished its first collection, will give information on a number of key points about the quality of treatment and the visual outcome against treatment. But from my knowledge of the database, it would be difficult at the moment to translate that into the numbers of people with visual impairment from AMD. I'm not saying it can't be done in the future, but it's important not to recognize the limitations of database. And if you're collecting data for one reason, it may not necessarily be expandable to another reason. But I'll bring it up with Martin McKibben, see what he thinks. The only way to really assess the level of visual impairment in the country is to do a large trial and actually have people going around looking at what the level of visual impairment is, actually going looking for trouble as opposed to waiting for patients to report it. And that has been done in some countries in localized areas. My understanding is that Professor Rupert Bourne from City University and from Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge has got funding for a pilot study of a national eye study, which would give information on the level of visual impairment in a specific area, which would then presumably lead to bigger studies in the future. But that's to work out the level of real visual impairment in the country. You need to do that, and the CVI system doesn't ask it in that way. It relies on volunteers reporting themselves, i.e. patients and staff. So that's the weakness. Having said that, it's the only thing we've got. The CVI system compares quite well with equivalent systems in other countries, apparently. And the data is not that dissimilar to the rest of Northern Europe. So, and in some respects, in some ways, we're better. But it does, it's the best we've got, and it is comparable. So I think we do need to keep it.
I think if you could raise that with Martin, it's good. It may not be the core function immediately, but if the visual acuity data is being collected nationally, there is a project that could, even if it's not core function, could then be used to compare with whatever is there, CVI, and just have a look at completeness, even if it was undertaken as a research project or an add-on. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind, Declan, raising that, that'd be fantastic. I do have one quick question for Caroline and Kathy, which was about the negative perception of patients for the for doing the certification, and that you do definitely get patients. I've definitely got patients who've really not been happy. They feel you're labeling me as blind. They feel it's going to mean, oh, this means that the doctors now think it's untreatable and they're never going to do anything anymore. How do you think we get over that? Because definitely there are patients that just say no because of that and see it as quite a negative label.
Yeah, I think, historically, I think that has been the case. But I think what we know, and I know from experience, is that somebody who said no, but has agreed to come for a conversation for support, by the end of the conversation has said yes. So it's about how you explain the certificate. And, I don't think the title is helpful. If it was an identification of visual impairment rather than a certificate, we're going to certificate you. It doesn't sound good, does it? But, we'd like to give you a piece of paper that identifies the level of sight you have, because it will help you to get access to support. That's the way I term it. And I think that sits better with people. And you say, you're the only one who's going to hold this piece of paper. You make the decision about who sees it. And so I think, explaining it more fully and helping people to understand what the process is gives them the opportunity of making an informed choice. And I think with the best will in the world, the consultants don't have that luxury of time in their clinics, which they would love to have, but they do not have. So the ECHOs can support with that.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's everyone playing to their strengths. I mean, it's I think once you've had an ECLO, why would you ever want to go back? I mean, you just don't know how you managed without. But I mean, if you, even though I know there's, say, Highland 20 units that don't have it, it's still, so I can remember when it was probably more like 20 units that did have it. So it is a massive achievement. And also I think, you know, the RNIB in particular have done so much work in this, and it's a real practical thing that you've done for our departments. That's what we love, some practical help that makes things better. So I think I just want to say thanks really for that. So just to sort of round up the meeting area, I want to thank you very much to all the speakers, and obviously so for Rob to co-chair, and in a minute I'll just ask him if he's got any closing remarks. I think from my point of view, we've got to get this stuff better. Many complaints and claims, if you just look, are the care was great, but the patient support was rubbish. And that's why people are bitterly unhappy. And it does, you know, it isn't just about, you know, diagnosing and dealing with a disease that is attached to a human being who has to live. And we've really just got to feed this in, and people's expectations of us meeting their emotional needs, their lifestyle needs, their well-being for, you know, a long and healthy life well into old age are much higher. Patients are expecting of this sort of thing, and we've got to rise to the challenge. Rob, I don't know if you want to just say anything to finish.
Yeah, no, I'd just like to thank everybody, and I just want to just think about what Kathy's just said, luxury of time. We know the clinical profession, you're under a lot of pressure and you don't have luxury of time. The numbers, the waiting lists, it just doesn't give you the time. I'm not saying that the first sector's got luxury of time, but we certainly want to be able to give you the support to enable that patients get the support that they need to help them on those clinical journeys. So I think, you know, it's been great to listen to everybody today. Thank you for everyone's input. And I really think we are making big steps now to ensure that patient support is inherent of the systems that we've got and we're working in, because there is so much change happening. And I'm just pleased that we're having these conversations and we're being involved in the designing of future models, and support is being embedded. So yeah, and hopefully, you know, I'm not sure that we'll ever have the luxury of time. Certainly at the moment, it doesn't seem like that we will, but let's try and work together to try and get at least some additional support to the patients. So absolutely, thank you, everyone.
I think there's some really positive things coming through that might make a big difference. So hopefully we'll be able to have updates on those over the coming months. So thank you all very much for attending. It's a pleasure to see everyone. And please do carry on coming to our virtual meetings. With any luck, we'll be seeing you in summer face to face. All right. Thanks very much and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.